in your opening statement, you commented upon several of the writings using the pseudonyms that were adopted at the time. Why did they use pseudonyms?
By using pseudonyms, they place the responsibility from one person to sort of these general ideas. And also under the name, for instance, the Anti-Federalist used the name Brutus. Brutus overthrew a tyrannical government. It sort of led connotations between overthrowing a tyrannical government in that way.
Exactly. All of the pseudonyms that they used were meant to evoke some sort of particular feeling, such as the federal farmer or Publius, who was a Roman who established, I believe, a republic.
It's a little creepy using Brutus. I mean, he was an assassin.
It may be considered a little creepy, but they were very passionate about what they believed, and perhaps this was the best way they thought they could espouse those ideals.
And furthermore, maybe the American people could better relate to Brutus, seeing as they just threw off a tyrannical king. And the fact that the very Constitution itself was throwing off the Articles of Confederation, which had been approved by all of the states.
Did people know who these pseudonymous authors were?
Well, there are some examples. If you look to the Sentinel specifically, it has now been discovered that Samuel Bryan was the one who wrote those papers. However, at the time period, perhaps local officials or local friends perhaps knew who wrote those papers, but as a whole, the entire Federalist and Anti-Federalist movement were not entirely sure who wrote which papers.
Why were some of the ratification conventions representing the small states so eager to ratify the Constitution as it was proposed?
The smaller states were more eager to ratify the Constitution than perhaps the larger states, because under the Constitution, they had more power than they had under the Articles of Confederation through the Senate.
Furthermore, in using the example of Delaware, Delaware, as such a small state in the middle of the country, was very economically dependent on the other states. Unlike some of the other states, Delaware couldn't survive by itself if it wasn't in an economic alliance with the rest of the new states.
Also, after Massachusetts ratified the Constitution, many of the other states followed very quickly after them, because Massachusetts set the precedent of arguing that at the first Congress they would be adding a list of amendments, which we later called the Bill of Rights. So many states decided to cut their discourse short after following suit.
You got to follow up on this issue of these anonymous, I guess today we would call them op-ed pieces. That's become now an issue because, well, newspapers, as you know, modern newspapers will not publish anonymous letters to the editor. It's not uncommon to have anonymous posts on the internet. What do you think about this balance? Should people be allowed to publicly voice opinions using pseudonyms?
In some instances, I feel like that's acceptable. However, I feel like with the introduction of the internet, if you don't cite your sources, it's entirely possible that I could go on the internet and write a blog that's completely filled with trash and not true facts, and someone could read it and think that it was true. So therefore, it's more important now with the introduction of modern media to cite who you are and what you know.
I would partially respectfully disagree with my colleague in saying that this idea of citing your sources was just as important back during the ratification debates. Many of the Federalist Papers were, in fact, not what the writers actually argued at the Constitutional Convention. Most notably, Alexander Hamilton decided to downplay the degree to which the states would erode the national government would erode state sovereignty, something that he certainly did not agree with and was shown during his actions with the Bank of the United States during Washington's term.
I would also point out that the nature of society has changed. When the Federalists and Anti-Federalists wrote using these pseudonyms, they were writing dignified, respectful articles, and on the internet in particular, the use of anonymity has led to significant increases in hate speech and generally disrespectful comments.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, I thought your opening statement was very well developed. I, too, was intrigued with your references to the Civil War. But something else that impressed me was your knowledge of the different delegates and their different viewpoints that were expressed. I thought you did a very fine job.
I liked your opening statement, although I don't agree with the slavery position. I've written a book on that subject, so I don't think I would agree. It was a very, very important issue all over the country. And it varies. As was said, different parts of the country had different feelings. Large states had different feelings. Large states were not, northern states, I should say, were not happy with the 3/5 clause that gave the South that kind of representation. The South wasn't particularly happy with it either. They wanted 5/5 of the slaves counted for their representation. But keeping the slave trade open, that is, the Congress not being able to prohibit it for 20 years, that was a crucial issue. The fugitive slave clause, Massachusetts had been the asylum. Massachusetts had, by judicial decree, had prohibited slavery in 1783. Now, the federal government was going to help return slaves. And there's an account, one of many accounts, but one account in particular, of Cato deciding to go back into slavery for 1 year so that he would then be free afterwards, rather than face the threat of being forced back into slavery because of that fugitive slave clause. That was October 1787. So even before the Constitution was adopted, it had a chilling impact on runaway slaves and the fear of keeping their independence. I liked very much your handling of pseudonyms. I think you did a very good job in discussing pseudonyms, and particularly toward the end, when I think it was Natalie said, they didn't always say the truth. They didn't say what they believed. Alexander Hamilton certainly opposed most of what was in the Constitution, but he wrote very favorably of it, particularly in Publius. Then the one last thing about amendments to the Constitution, all but one have been adopted by the state legislatures.
Several minutes later.
Yes, not only one, and that was prohibition.
Prohibition.
That's right, because they couldn't get that through the state legislatures.
Right.
This is, to a great extent, we look upon the framers as great intellectuals, philosophical men, but they were also profound politicians, and they understood that the difficulty of getting through the state legislatures, which you mentioned, that they don't want to give up power, but another, it's just numbers. If you go through the state legislatures, you've got to run the gauntlet of getting approval of 24 bodies. That is, there are 11 bicameral legislatures and 2 unicameral legislatures. If you go with state conventions, that's only 9 that you've got to get approval of to get ratification. So it was an easier process, and they all knew that. Except for those 2 things that I mentioned, I think you did a very, very good job.
Thank you.
And I'll say ditto. I liked your opening statement a lot, and I thought that you were, for the most part, able to, when I pressed you for specifics on references in your opening statement, I thought you did a pretty good job of supporting it. I liked your answer on the international aspect, particularly the Australian reference. I don't know where that came from, but that was pretty good. Certainly taught me something I didn't know. And I just find you a very poised and confident group who seems to have genuinely know what you're talking about, not just sort of reciting facts, and that's pretty impressive. So thank you.
Thank you.